Hello, learners, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 7. For this particular part, we're going to get into the appendicular skeleton and go through our tour of that. And then we're going to be focusing on developmental aspects and clinical conditions related to the skeleton. So let's first start with the appendicular skeleton. And our first stop is going to be the shoulder girdle, or you can also say pectoral girdle. So you can write shoulder here. Either way you said, it will be correct. This is going to attach the arms to the axial skeleton. Remember, we said all the girdles, meaning our shoulder girdle, excuse me, and also pelvic girdle is what's going to help us attach our limbs to the axial skeleton. So we're going to first start with the pectoral girdle or our shoulder girdle. And this is again part of the appendicular skeleton. Now, there are going to be two bones that are related to the shoulder girdle, and that's going to be the clavicle and the scapula. So the clavicle, we normally see this as collarbones, and the clavicle is going to articulate or form a joint with the sternum and the scapula. All right, looking at the purple picture here, we see we have our clavicle. Okay, that's going to be in purple. And as you can see, it's going to form a joint with the sternum. Going to be a medial joint that's formed, and then with the scapula is going to be that lateral joint there. Now, the side of the clavicle that's going to form with the sternum is going to be very thick and blocky, whereas the side, that's the medial side, whereas the lateral side that articulates with the scapula is going to be sort of flat. And so we'll see some visuals of that as we go along. Okay. Another thing we notice is that it curves and kind of swoops over, and then the tip of it is hitting the scapular shoulder blade. And so that's one thing you can look at when you're thinking of the clavicle as well. Now let's go ahead and hit the scapula, which is going to be our shoulder blades. Okay. Again, this is going to articulate with the clavicle, which we see here, but it's also going to articulate with the humerus. So that's going to be a long bone in the upper arm, which we're going to get through as we go along. Now, the beauty of the scapula is that it's very superficial. It's easy to see and move. It's almost like when you see people move their actual upper arms or their shoulders. You can also see the clavicle moves a lot as well. And you can actually feel your scapula move too. Sometimes people used to call them, when I was a kid, they used to say, oh my God, the angel wing, the angel wing. That's just your scapula or shoulder blades. And it moves where your arms move. So if I move my arm up, you're going to see that pectoral girdle or that shoulder blade, even collarbone, have the ability to move. And you can feel that. Now let's talk about how. We already said that there's going to be a lateral articulation with the scapula and the collarbone. And the process that allows that articulation is going to be called the acromonian process. And that's going to be where the scapula meets the clavicle. Process here, and you can also see that process here. And that makes sense because if you're saying that the collarbone is coming up and it's going to be flat, sort of flat here, then that's where you can have that articulation. And where that meets is going to be that acromonian process. We also have the glenoid cavity. Remember, we did say it articulates with the humerus. And so here's the glenoid cavity here. You'll also see it over here. Now, the beauty of the glenoid cavity is that it's going to be a very shallow depression so that the humerus can move a lot. So if you have your arms, you can move your arms in so many different ways, right? I'm like swinging my arms around right now. And that's because the glenoid cavity is going to be a depression, but it's more of a shallow depression. So it's not completely immovable in some kind of way, or it doesn't like restrict the movement of the arms. And we also call this the joint or the shoulder socket. Okay, so it's a little shallow joint for the shoulder socket. And again, it's where the arm comes in and makes the shoulder socket itself. So it's really called a ball and socket joint, which we get into chapter 8. But we want to keep that in mind as well. Let's look at kind of the anterior view. The anterior view is going to be the most anatomical view that we normally see, right? But this is also the area that's kind of against the back. So when I tell you that you can kind of like feel different pieces of the scapula or feel someone else's scapula as they're moving around, that's the reason why. And again, that shoulder cavity or that glenoid cavity has a kind of shallow depression to allow more movement. Let's go ahead and look at some visuals of this. All right, so again, here's our clavicle. We see that blunt end is going to meet the sternum, and that will be our sternum end here. You also see the sternal end here, and it's going to articulate with the sternum. And then we also have our lateral side, which is going to articulate with the scapula, which we said is very flat. So this is where that flat end is. And of course, that's the acromial end because it's going to form the acromion process where the scapula and clavicle are going to meet. And we also have various right scapula as well, posterior and anterior view. So here's our anterior aspect. And we see we're going to have our acromion, which again, the clavicle is going to come off of to be able to articulate the scapula. And then we're also going to be able to see that glenoid cavity where our humerus is going to go. We're going to talk about that as well. And you can see it in both views. Since we've already been talking about the limbs, like the humerus, let's go ahead and get to the bones of the upper limbs, okay? And there's going to be 3 bones that we focus on. And this is going to be, again, the bones of the arm and the forearm. So the bone of the arm, which is going to be a part of that glenoid cavity or that joint or shoulder socket, is going to be the humerus. Now the humerus, you can just say is a large bone of the upper limb. It has a round head or round part that fits into the shoulder and that glenoid cavity. So if you look over here, we do have our clavicle, we do have our scapula here, and we do have the humerus. And if you kind of just look at that a little bit closer or zoom in when you download the lecture portion, you'll definitely notice that there is a head of that humerus there. And I'm going to show you a better visual as well. So that humerus has like a head that comes out. And that head is going to be able to be fit perfectly into that glenoid cavity of the scapula, allowing for movement. Okay? A better visual of the humerus, we see that head portion that's going to go into that glenoid cavity of the shoulder girdle. And then we have the diaphysis that we already used to. And then also we have our knuckles at the bottom. Those are our condyles. And again, these condyles have curved areas that's going to articulate with the forearm bones. What are the forearm bones? Our radius and our ulna. So let's go back to what we previously were talking about and get down to the radius. So the radius is going to first be lateral to the ulna. So when we're looking over here, here's going to be our radius side, and here is our ulna side, R and U. And of course, this is our humerus. Now, what do we notice about the radius? The radius is on the same side as the thumb. So if you go and put a thumbs up, you know that you are dealing with the radius side, right? So it's going to be the same side as the thumb. That's going to be number one thing. And it has a circular head that articulates with the humerus. Remember we said we have those knuckles or the condyles that are going to choose to articulate with the forearm bones when it came to the humerus. Well, there's going to be one circular head on the radius that can fit right into where you're going to have your radius and your humerus connect. Here's the radius here. And if you look at the head of the radius, you'll notice that it does have a circular shape, but it's going to be here at the top. It looks like a flat circle. So it looks like you have like a flat circle, but if you were to have a different view of that same circle, then that's what you'll be looking at. So that's where they get kind of that circular head that articulates with the humerus. Okay? And of course, when you're looking at the condyles or the knuckles between, each of the bones where you actually form joints, then yes, you can see that there's going to be a space for that circular radius head to be able to connect with the humerus. And you can definitely see that here. We have our humerus and we have our kind of head of the radius that is a flat circle at the top. There you go. Now, let's also go ahead and just give more details about the radius itself. It allows you to turn your hand. So it's going to allow you to turn your hand. So if you go ahead and you are turning your hand and your wrist, that's because, again, you're moving things from the radius onto the thumb side, and that's how you're able to I'm turning my hand left and right. As you can see, well, you can't see that, but I'm turning my hand left and right, and if you do it, you can see what I'm doing. I'm just turning my thumb inward and outward, and that's because the radius allows that. Now let's go ahead and get into the ulna. So the ulna is going to be medial to the radius. So as you can see, it's going to be closer to the medial line of the anatomical structure. Now this is going to make a U in the sagittal view. So the ulna makes a U, which makes sense because again, it kind of helps remember U ulna, okay? And it also makes a hinge with the humerus. So let's go ahead and see what that means. First of all, we already know the radius allows us to move our thumb inward, outward, or towards the medial area, lateral, towards the medial area, lateral, and kind of just bend in different ways. Where the ulna is going to allow us to do those bicep curls. It's really going to be the radius and the ulna that allows us to do kind of those, bend our arms up and down, up and down, up and down. But if we want to bend our arms up and down, that's ulna and radius. If we want to bend our arms up and down and then move our wrist or hand, then that's going to be the radius that allows us to move the hand, and the ulnar radius that allows us to bend it up and down. Okay? Remember we said the ulna makes a U, so if you were to hold an ulna bone in your hand, you'll see at the posterior end, you will have a U shape. You kind of have that U shape here. Okay? And we also can see that U shape here as well. Okay? So just keep that in mind. And again, we will have that U shape that's kind of used to be able to attach to that or articulate with that humerus. Another thing that we'll notice is that we do have that hinge with the actual humerus as well. So this is going to be that hinge or that articulation or hinge. And we're going to learn more about that in chapter 8, but that's going to be a hinge to the humerus itself. And then again, here's that posterior U. So it is kind of nice. Another thing I noticed about the ulnar is that there is kind of a little process that's extending at the end of it that kind of is very pointy. And when you're looking at the ulna on the view here, where it's like towards your actual pinky, sometimes you'll see folks always say, oh, well, the ulna points to the pinky. So the pointing end of the ulna is going to be pointing towards the pinky. The radius is always going to be on the same side as the thumb. So no matter how you turn it, always think thumb is radius, pinky is going to be ulna. Just to orient you, a lot of these images are going to be in anatomical position. So yes, we're going to have the palm up and forward, and then of course the thumb is going to be out. Okay, so just keep those details in mind too. Let's move on to our hands, okay? So we're at the appendicular skeleton where we're talking about, again, upward limbs, and our focus is going to be the hands. Orient ourselves. We have the shoulder girdle, and that glenoid cavity is going to attach the head of the humerus, and the humerus is going to articulate with the radius that's on the thumb side, and of course, the ulna that's on the pinky side, okay? That's one thing we know. Now, that ulnar radius also has the ability to create or articulate a joint with your hand. So if you were to bend your hand right now, a lot of folks think that's where the wrist starts. You even hear people say bending of the wrist, bending of the wrist. But that bending is actually the joint for our radius and humerus connecting to our carpus. Okay? Or again, those would be our wrist and our wrist bone. You just keep that in mind. But when you're thinking of the wrist bones by itself, you really want to think of the wrist bones as the base of your hand. So I have my joint, which I'm moving, and then right above that joint is going to be where my wrist bones are going to start. Okay? So it's going to be the joint with the radius and ulna, and then you start the actual carpus. So the wrist and hand are made of 3 sets of bone. You're going to see a similar 3 sets of bones when it comes to the lower limbs and the foot as well. First is going to be the carpals. That's the main difference between the foot and the hand. There's going to be the name for the first set of bones. They're called tarsals with feet, and then with hands, they're carpals. And there's going to be 8 short bones. And they're here in green. No, we do not have to know all the different 8 bones, so just keep that in mind. This is an anterior view of the left hand. Of course, the palm is up. Okay? So the palm's up, that means we're dealing with the thumb all the way to the pinky. The next sort of bones is going to be our metacarpals. These are long bones of the palm. So if they're long bone, yes, we know they're going to have 2 epiphyses, and that's going to be the wide end of the bone, and then we know we're going to have a diaphysis. Going back to our chapter 6 information, right? So this is going to be the long bones of the palm and basically the back of your hand. So these are going to be a little bit easier to feel because each of these bones are going to line up with the finger. And so that means you're going to have 5 of these metacarpals. 5 of those. You got 8 of these short bones, 5 of these. So do you need to know every 8 short bones? No. Go to your study guide and look up the bones you need to know. But do you need to know that they're called carpals? Yes. Metacarpals, there's 5 of them. Okay, we have our distal epiphyses form the knuckles. So first what I do is I just have my hand open and I just try to feel the bones that are forming the base of my fingers. So all the bones that are in the palm of my hand, it's all going to each single bone there, right? So, or each single finger, excuse me. And then of course they form the knuckles at the top. So if you were to close your fist, you'll see all those knuckles are related to the distal epiphyses. Huh? that means the proximal epiphyses will be here, in these areas. And this will be where your knuckles are. All right, and this is again in the palm of your hand. These are numbered 1 through 5 from the thumb to the pinky. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you see. And then finally, we have the phalanges. This is something that you might used to be seeing, especially, I don't know, if you grew up in the early 2000s, people just will pull out their fingers and say phalanges, phalanges, because they're just kind of shaking their fingers or their toes. And this is going to be for 14 tiny long bones. So again, there's 14 of them. Do you need to know all the names? No. Do you need to know that they're phalanges? Yes. Now, the cool thing about phalanges is that the first 4 fingers are all going to have the same phalanges. The thumb is only going to have 2 of those particular phalanges. Now, each finger is going to have a proximal phalanx, and phalanx just means it's singular of phalanges. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And it also means, so just keep that in mind. It's almost like all these 14 tiny long bones come together to form your fingers. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There's a proximal one, and then, of course, there's a middle one. And then there is a distal one. So we can see that here. We have a proximal phalanx, which is going to be here. And each of our finger bones have this. And then we have a middle, and then we have a distal. It's the reason why we can bend our fingers in different ways. When you see the thumb, it only bends 1. That's because it only has 2. That's going to be the proximal and the distal only. So it does not have a middle phalanx. You keep that in mind as well. And that's literally just going to be our, tour of the upper limbs. Next, we're going to get into the lower limbs, and hopefully these videos are going to be helpful to you. See you there.